Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. Welcome to another episode of What Matters Today, where we delve into pressing global issues and conflicts. In today's episode, we turn our focus on the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, a topic that has captured international attention. As we navigate the complexities of this conflict, we aim to provide you with a deeper understanding of the historical context, the root causes, the latest developments, and discuss potential pathways to peace. My guest today is Riccardo Bocco, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at the Geneva Graduate Institute. So my first question is, what are the root causes and historical context behind the Israel-Hamas conflict, and how have they shaped the current situation? And specifically, what led up to the events of October 7th?
Well, the root causes go back, according to different observers, either at the time of the creation of the Zionist movement, late 19th century, the creation of the British mandate over Palestine, and then the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, following the Arab-Israeli War of 48-49. But this has been compounded by the loss of Palestinian territory. 78% of historic Palestine has become the present Israeli state, and 22% after 48 was divided between Jordan, who annexed the West Bank, and Gaza went under Egyptian military administration. Then the 67 war meant the occupation by Israel of West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai and Golan and East Jerusalem. So since 67, the occupation has meant a progressive grabbing of land and forced the Palestinian population displacement for the sake of the creation of Eretz Israel in the view of the Zionist and Orthodox view for the creation. So basically, the occupation has meant the colonization of the West Bank and Gaza, which means today that more than 700,000 settlers, Israeli settlers, live between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And especially during the past year and a half, the attacks of the Israeli settlers against the Palestinian populations have been increasing with the support of the Israeli army. Gaza had been evacuated in 2005 by the settlers, but since Gaza has become an open sky prison. And therefore, there are root causes and more immediate causes to the upsurge of violence we are assisting to.
How does the presence and influence of Orthodox Judaism in Israel relate to or impact the Israel-Hamas conflict?
This is a very important point. Actually, in terms of public relations and image, Israel has been for a long time trying to silence whatever analysis or rumor of the importance of the Orthodox communities in Israel, showing them rather as a folkloric group. Actually, one of the core issues today for Israeli society and politics is exactly the rise to power of the Hasidim, Haredim, and the different religious, ultra-religious communities. How it comes? We have to go back to the War of 48 and especially the creation of the state in 49, where Ben-Gurion decided not to adopt a constitution because he was fearing that by having to inscribe in the constitution what a Jewish state was, he had to decide what kind of orthodoxy was the one of the new state of Israel. And this was meeting opposition by different Orthodox group, from the those who were basically saying that the state of Israel is illegitimate because the Messiah has not yet come,
Right.
to those, in particular the secular Ashkenazi, those who actually set up the Labour Party, they were favoring with religious arguments also the creation of the State of Israel as a first stage facilitating the coming of the Messiah. Anyway, until 77, the Orthodox were marginalized. And what is important to take into account is that during that period where the Labour Party was in power, the different Jewish communities that migrated to Israel, in particular those from Arab countries, they were called the Arab Jews. Arab Jews, or Sephardi, or Mizrahim, as they are called, they were considered second-class citizens in Israel. They were more often than not sent to camp of re-education to instill in them the vision of the Sabra, of the new Israeli man, according to Zionist Ashkenazi precepts and conception. Actually, it is in 1977 when the Likud first came to power under Menachem Begin, and Begin understood the importance of including these marginalized communities, where the ultra-Orthodox view was very important. They actually also formed a party, the Shas, which was later on disqualified for membership in the Knesset because being considered a terrorist, being considered as well as racist, etc. So what we can say about the emergence and of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel is that they have reached recently the government with a number of ministers, among them Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, who are actually very outspoken when they have been affirming a few months ago, for example, that they have to end the ethnic cleansing work that began in 1948. Or how Smotrich reacted to the settlers' assault on the village of Huwara and the response of the Palestinian population, saying basically that the village of Huwara in the West Bank should be razed.
Right.
So what happens is that Netanyahu, for its own sake, because he was trying to avoid by the reform against the Supreme Court, avoid his own misdeeds, and he has been indicted for several cases, to overthrow the current law. And therefore, he allied with extreme wing and ultra-Orthodox supremacist religious groups. So, in short, I would say that this story of the emergence of a form of religious nationalism in Israel is much more dangerous than we may think. And is dangerous, first of all, for the social fabric inside the Israeli society and policies.
You've been doing a lot of interviews in Swiss media recently, and you mentioned not too long ago that, quote, declaring Hamas a terrorist organization contradicts Switzerland's neutrality, end quote. Can you expand on this, please?
Yes, of course. If you allow me, just one point I forgot to mention before. The past 30 years in Israel mirror some way what has been happening in Palestinian society. The rise of a form of religious nationalism, the one represented today mainly by Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, which is a smaller group compared to Hamas. This also follows a trend that is very meaningful to understand why we are where we are. The Hamas was born in Gaza during the 80s, at a time when Ariel Sharon, was the military governor. And Sharon actually facilitated if not the creation, anyway, the development of the Hamas activities, their caritative work, their social work, etc. Why? Because Sharon has always been looking at South Africa as an example, meaning South Africa was teaching two lessons for the Israeli leader. First, you never have to be demographically inferior to your enemy. And second, you should try to divide the forces inside your enemy. What did the white power in South Africa was to create, or better, to stimulate the creation of the Inkatha, which was a Zulu movement that began to oppose the policies of the ANC, the African National Congress. And in a very similar way, Hamas has played that role in relation to the PLO and Fatah. Officially, Hamas was created in 1987 at the beginning of the first Intifada. When the Oslo Accords were signed, and therefore the end of the first Intifada, Hamas opposed the decision taken by the Fatah representing the PLO, meaning that what Hamas was condemning was the fact that Arafat had betrayed the Palestinian national movement by not accepting to include in the negotiation, in the juridical basis of the negotiations, the resolution 194, the resolution of November 1948, that affirms that the Palestinian refugees have the right to return and or compensation. On that basis, Hamas opposed the Oslo Accords. And then starting from 1994, following the massacre of Baruch Goldstein at the Kavod the Patriarch in Hebron, began the war of terrorism between Hamas and the Israeli army. That ushered into the second Intifada, and then basically Gaza became the official military opponents and resistance to Israel. And we have seen the wars of 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and so on. Meaning that Hamas today represent these forms of religious nationalism with all the risk, and this applies as well to the ultra-Orthodox Israelis, the fact that in both cases they have a messianic view. And the religious leaders, they are not ready to compromises. They know that they can kill and be killed, and they will go to paradise. So that is an issue that we cannot put under the carpet. It has been done so far. The international community has closed the eyes on all of that, right, and has been trying to manage a conflict, to keep it as much as possible at a low intensity level, but without looking for a conflict resolution formula. So now to go back to your question, the Swiss government has began 10 days ago a debate at the level of the Federal Council to classify Hamas as a terrorist group. Now, the definition of terrorism is a political one, is not a juridical one. A terrorist act is done to create terror among a civilian population. It can be perpetrated by a person, by a group, or by a state. In this case, both Hamas as an armed group has been perpetrating terror attacks, and the Israeli state, through its army, has been perpetrating terror attacks in Gaza. Now, what is more important is not much the label of terrorism, but rather to condemn this act by Hamas or the Israeli state as crimes of war and crimes against humanity. This is what it counts in terms of accountability for international law. Now, more recently, and this is what is extremely worrying me, is that before yesterday, the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been suspending its aid to 6 mainly human rights NGO. Right. 5 are Israelis and 6 are Palestinians. Now, we should recall that starting from 2009, when Netanyahu came back to the power in September 2009, starting from December of the same year, he began to tell the international community that they should stop funding Israeli human rights NGOs because these NGOs were the enemies of the interior for Israel. They were basically self-hating Jews. At the same level, also the Israeli foreign minister asked his counterparts in the West to suspend any funding to Palestinian NGOs working in the field of human rights. So far, and when I mention those NGOs, I'm thinking on the Israeli side to B'Tselem, to Breaking the Silence, Yesh Din. I mean, very important Israeli NGOs. On the Palestinian side, Al-Haq. Well, there is a real group of important human rights NGOs. Anyway, what happens now is that not only Switzerland is trying to classify Hamas as a terrorist group, I would like to understand what is the advantage for Switzerland for doing that. They are basically cutting the grass under their feet if they want to keep their position as possible mediators or interlocutor. I mean, Switzerland doesn't have a political weight, but has a moral weight. And being the depository of the fourth Geneva Convention of the international law of humanitarian law, it has a role to play, which it played for a long time. On top, I would say, until the arrival of Ignazio Cassis, who is known to be part of the Liberal Party pro-Israeli group in the parliament, Ignazio Cassis has progressively affirmed his pro-Israeli position. And this, again, I would like to understand how this profits to Switzerland.
Right.
Last but not least, the situation in Switzerland, as usual in this context, but not only in Switzerland, Europe, in Europe as well, we have been witnessing anti-Semitic acts. This is very worrying. I mean, anti-Semitism is racism, pure racism, and it has to be, of course, condemned. But let me bet, if the president of the Israeli the communauté israélite, the Jewish communities in Switzerland, and other different rabbis in the country would clearly say that the assault of Hamas of October the 7th was a crime of war and a crime of humanity. And at the same time, what Israel, the Israeli army, in its revenge is doing are as well acts of crimes of war and crimes against humanity. If there was a plain and clear declaration in this sense, I bet that at least 80% of the anti-Semitic act will drop in Switzerland.
And for my last question, which I know is a difficult one, but needs to be asked, what potential solutions or pathways to peace can be explored to bring about a lasting resolution to the Israel-Hamas conflict?
Well, I think that we have to think to that. And before the conflict already, there has been several discussions going on, not much at the government level, but at the civil society level between Israelis and Palestinians, both in the country and in the diaspora. Meaning that the classical two-state solution doesn't seem to be anymore an option. I mean, if you look at the map of the West Bank, you will quickly see that the map of the colonies and the geography created by the Zionist settler colonization will not permit for the creation of a state, Palestinian state, on the 22% of historic Palestine that has been left to them. The options that are on the table are actually three main hypotheses. One is what is called the creation of a democratic state. Second one is that of a binational state. And the third one is that of a confederation. Before defining the juridical models, there are a number of issues that have to be discussed. And these discussions are going on. Meaning, if you have one state, how do we call it?
Right.
What will be the religious components of the definition of the state? Because we have Jewish citizens, Muslim citizens, and Christian citizens.
Right.
So should we opt for a definition that includes a religious component? Of course, this for the Jewish population is basic, but this is to be discussed. Then you have a very simple problem, simple, so to speak. I mean, what about the colonies? What about having a federation? I mean, the Swiss model for having cantons. How to draw a map of different cantons in this one state. What the cantons would be a mixed population, single ethnicity population, only Jewish and Arabs. But this can be discussed. And then, last but not least, in a long list of issues, there is the question of taxation and fiscality. Because if you have a federal state, part of the taxes of the citizens go to the capital, and there will be the issue of Jerusalem,
yes,
capital. And part of the taxes of the citizens would go to the federal state, and the rest at the cantons level.
Right.
So it's very tricky, but I think this is a debate that we have to face. And since there are Israeli and Palestinian civil society representatives that discuss and work on this, we should enter into the debate. When I say we, not only academic researchers, but again, to go back to the role of Switzerland, how Switzerland, which is a federal state, could contribute to a debate on that, for example.
Professor Bocco, thank you very much for participating in this episode of What Matters Today. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.